Now, what about inspections? How does that? What do I need to have inspected? Inspections, I'm sure, are very, very important, but what do I need to have inspected specifically?
Well, it depends in large part on what it is that you're buying. And let me just back up a little bit, because once the seller and buyer reach the terms of their agreement, it's obviously a written document, that starts the clock running typically on when inspections have to be completed and what types of inspections are going to be done. If you're buying a home in a planned unit development where everything was built by the same builder, or a condo, something that is not really a big custom job, you're usually okay with just having your typical home inspector. And that would be somebody who your agent recommends, or you could get recommendations for. They typically only spend, those types of inspectors typically only spend a couple hours at the property, so they're not going to be able to cover everything. It's just physically, and there's just not enough time, and frankly, they're not making enough money to do a full, a complete full inspection. Oftentimes, if the roof is inaccessible, they won't go up on the roof. They can't get behind the walls because you're typically not allowed to destroy property to inspect it. They may not have the expertise to tell you whether the site was planned properly, whether there's drainage issues, geologic issues, etc. But if you don't have that type of a property, typically you don't need those types of inspections. On the other hand, if you're buying a home that is a hillside home, perhaps, that has a lot of drainage around it, where it looks like there might have been issues in the past, you may want to get a civil engineer out there to look at how it's designed. You may also want to get a geologist to look at the site to give you an opinion as to whether or not the house was properly constructed on the soil that
What
it
about
sits
things
on.
like mold and those kinds of things?
Well,
because I know it's been an issue in the past.
Right. Mold is a big issue these days. Frankly, there's probably not a house in the country that doesn't have a little bit of mold in it. On the other hand, you don't want anything that's dangerous or pervasive. A lot of times the typical inspector will, if he sees something, he or she sees something that might be mold, they'll note it, and then they'll suggest that you get a mold specialist in there. There's one other potential inspector that I wanted to mention, and that is if the house had some earthquake renovation. We had an earthquake, seems like a long time ago, it wasn't really that long ago. You may want to get a structural engineer out there to look at what was done and give an opinion as to whether it was done properly.
And what about insects and that kind of inspection? What am I thinking of?
Termites.
Termites, yes.
Termites.
I can think of a word.
The typical contract that real estate agents use has a provision in there or an addendum to it which usually requires that a seller have the property inspected for termites, and then there's a negotiation as to if there are damages, damage done by the termites, who has to pay to fix it.
And we've got to make sure that they're licensed and all that. And
yes,
that kind of
yes. Most of your real estate agents work with termite inspectors, and they'll refer you to somebody.
What for a buyer, and I get the purchase agreement, what are some of the things that today people need to look out for in purchase agreements?
Well, typically the purchase agreement starts with a buyer making an offer.
Right.
So the buyer, usually their agent, and that agent can be the same agent that represents the seller, or can be a separate agent that the buyer uses for that particular purchase. I always recommend, particularly if the buyer's spending a lot of money, that the buyer have their own agent, so that he or she has somebody that's just working for them rather than somebody that's working both sides of the fence. But a buyer, as I mentioned earlier, for certain types of homes, probably should ask the seller and make it part of the agreement to provide all the underlying documents that we spoke about earlier. And the buyer also wants to make sure that the contract gives him or her enough time to do what they need to do in order to close their transaction. They're going to be, they have to get a loan, they have to get the property appraised, they have to get the property inspected, and those things take time. And depending on how busy all these third parties are, the buyer, and he does this with the agent, want to make sure that there's enough time to complete everything.
How long does that usually take? What's the time period?
Well, I mean, you can close the sale of a home in a week or two if you've got everything.
But what do you
got
recommend?
a loan lined up. If it's something that is going to require more than, one inspector that is going to charge $300-400 to give the place a once over, and if it's not going to be a complex loan, you can probably close a deal in 30 days. Okay. If there's more inspections and if the loan is somewhat complicated, you want to leave yourself probably 60 days.
Now, where does escrow come in?
Well, an escrow is a third party that basically handles all the documentation. They're, if you will, a repository for all the documents, all of the money, ultimately the buyer's down payment, the loan proceeds. They make sure that the seller's lender, if there is one, is paid off. And typically an escrow company will not act unless both parties agree that they can act.
And what kinds of insurances would I need to obtain as a buyer?
Well, if the property is, if there's a lender involved, the lender will require at the very least fire insurance, and most people will want a homeowner's policy if they can get one that provides liability. Earthquake insurance has gotten more expensive and it has covered less over the years, and that's really something that is individual to, it's really something that an individual has to decide for him or herself if they want to spend the money on the insurance in order to get, less coverage than was available before.
Getting back to loan documents, of course we all hear about the reports today about lenders that are not ethical, so to speak, and a lot of people have found out that they're in lots of trouble. What would you recommend when someone gets a loan? How do you get involved with something like that?
Well, I usually don't, except for
because the documents now are so thick. I mean, how can anybody understand some of the loan documents?
They are, and frankly, I think it's a shame that there isn't as much transparency as I think there ought to be. I believe that out of this subprime will come legislation that will require more transparency in loans, but we're not there yet. I think the most important thing for a buyer is to know what his or her credit score is, though, because if your credit score is too low, you are not going to be able to qualify to get the best loan products. In addition, you want to work with a lender that has the ability to lend, to give you the best loan and not what we call a subprime loan. There are companies out there that advertise on the radio and on television that only provide subprime loans, whether you have perfect credit or not. That's all they sell. You don't want to go with one of those.
Now, what is the definition of a subprime loan?
Somebody with less than stellar credit.